Hello everybody, welcome back to some more reveals for the Great Dark Beyond, the next Hearthstone expansion. It's going to come out in early November. We're seeing today a lot of the neutral cards that are going to come out, not all of them, but a big chunk of them. We're also going to see a real big card, and let's actually start off with this real big card. Introducing the first 3-digit Hearthstone card ever printed, the Ceaseless Expanse. 100 mana, 15/15. Costs 1 less for each time a card was drawn, played, or destroyed. Battlecry, destroy all other minions. The 15/15s in 2024 versus, 15/15s in 2023. Actually, funnily enough, we have got some 15/15s in the past, cut from a very similar cloth, for example. Phantom had one of these weird effects, where like it's a minion with a ginormous mana cost, but there's some way obviously to discount the mana cost. Similarly, Rescue, which is actually seeing some play right now in Standard. Also, big mana cost, but gets discounted, and actually by a fairly similar mechanic to Ceaseless Expanse. That is just on minions dying, but importantly with both the Ceaseless Expanse and Rescue, it's on both sides of the board, which is kind of why this card is so hard to evaluate how good it is. Because the card's quality and like how fast it is discounted depends not only on your deck, but your opponent's, which means it kind of depends on the meta, so to speak. So, yeah, it's going to be really hard to work this card out. I have tried to put some stuff together for it to like give you an idea of how fast I think you're realistically going to be able to play this. Assuming you play a minion every turn, and I meant a minion dies every turn, and a card is played every turn is what I meant to say, and also you're drawing a card every single turn. This means you're getting a 3 mana discount per player per turn. There are 2 players in the game of Hearthstone, typically, so you're about getting a 6 mana deduction every single turn. Now, you can't play this card normally, unless you're a druid, until you reach 10 mana crystals. So this means it's going to be looking at getting like a 90 mana reduction before you can play it. And if you do 90 divided by 6, it works out with about 15. And by about, it is 15. So it's going to suggest that you're going to have to wait like 15 turns to play this card. Now, obviously, this is like the low roll estimate. Most games of Hearthstone, as the game goes on, you play more cards. More minions die. You draw more cards. In the early game, you're less likely to play a card, you're less likely for a minion to die, so on, and you're less likely to draw additional cards. So I kind of see this as being like the low roll estimate, and probably the only situation where this would ever occur is if you were in a control v control matchup. And by the way, unsurprisingly, I think this card would be most likely going into some sort of longer drawn out control deck. So if you went into a Ceaseless Expanse deck versus Ceaseless Expanse deck, you might actually have to wait like 15 turns there or thereabouts before this card could be played. In some like real extreme examples, you might even have to go beyond that because people are very, very reluctant to play cards if your opponent is just going to clear them off the board easily. On the flip side, if you then double these numbers, and I kind of see this rather than you doing, 2 cards per turn and so on, and your opponent doing the same thing. Let's say you're playing the control deck and you're still doing I play 1 minion per turn, 1 minion dies per turn, I play 1 card per turn, I draw a card per turn. If you go up against an aggro deck, they're probably going to be something like playing 3 cards at a time. They're going to have 3 minions dying at a time, or 3 or more minions, and so on and so forth. They're going to be playing cards rapidly, they're going to be drawing through their deck rapidly. At which point you're getting like a 6 mana discount per player per turn, which works out as 12 mana per turn. And if you do 90 divided by 12, you get 7.5. Obviously, you can't have a half a turn, so round it up to 8. Now, the thing about this, though, is if you got this scenario, which I think is like an ultra rapid scenario, in 8 turns, this card would be 10 mana. But obviously, at the 8th turn, you would only have 9 mana crystals, unless you were a druid. So you won't be able to play this card then. So most realistically, the fastest I think you'll ever play this card is at 9 mana crystals. Do I think that means this is good enough? I actually don't know. My gut feeling is no, I don't think this card is going to be good enough. And part of the reason for this is... Oh, let me get to this in a moment, but one of the cards I think this is similar to is Soul Stealer, which was 8 mana with a similar effect, but obviously without the stat line. Just before I jump back down to that, because I'll get to this on another slide. There are ways to make this effect go down faster. If you do play like some sort of handlock type deck, you could use Gaslight Gatekeeper to cycle your hand. If you have 10 cards in hand, for example, and you Gaslight Gatekeeper this, you get a 10 mana reduction for the cost of 4. Do I think that's worth it? No, not really. You could play a more like control Death Knight deck, and I think there is a potential where you do put Ceaseless Expanse in a control Death Knight deck, and then use stuff like Ghoul's Knight and some of the other cards which summon multiple different minions that you can either rush or just randomly attack. In which case, if you play like this tokeny control deck, then Ceaseless Expanse obviously gets reduced way faster. You can also always just play Marin and hit it with a wand and just get a 100 mana reduction. That might actually be the most realistic way you're going to be playing the Ceaseless Expanse. But anyway, to get back to what I was mentioning before, the card effect is effectively Soul Stealer. Now, Soul Stealer is a pretty good card, and one of the big reasons that people do want to play, you know, double Blood Rune control Death Knight decks is Soul Stealer. There are other things like Corpse Explosion as well, which I think is like a nicer card in a sense that it comes up earlier, so it's better to control the aggro boards that are going to come up faster. By the time that Soul Stealer is really like active, you've probably lost to an aggro deck, right? They're not waiting for you to get to 8 mana crystals. So Soul Stealer is pretty good, but it's more good for these big high value matchups. And I kind of see the same thing with Ceaseless Expanse. It might be in a control deck, but it's going to be a counter to some big high value turn. Now, obviously, unlike Soul Stealer, which again, good card, Soul Stealer is only a 5/5. Ceaseless Expanse is a 15/15. That's pretty spooky. If your opponent can't deal with the 15/15 on their subsequent turn, that is half your life total kaput. So there is some merit in this card not just being a control card, but it's been some sort of like finisher for a control deck. You play your Ceaseless Expanse, clear the board, and then you just hope that the 15/15 lives, and then you can push that through for more damage. Do I think realistically the 15/15 lives to do that trade? Probably not. It will be mitigated by some means, but some decks cannot just full stop deal with 15/15s. By the way, obviously when people saw this 100 mana effect, they immediately started thinking about cards which had effects based on the cost of a card. Holy Wrath is like one of the big examples of this. This is now a wild only combo, by the way. Standard players, just calm down for a moment. Reduce the heart rate. You can't see this in standard. Holy Wrath is only in wild. But Holy Wrath's effect is draw a card, deal damage equal to its cost. 5 mana, deal 100 damage. It's a pretty strong effect, especially when in Paladin, and again this is wild only, they have Hoarder in the court, so they can put this on the top card of the deck. So for 7 mana you can deal 100 damage. That's a pretty good deal for 7 damage. However, it is countered in wild by Igneous Lava Gorger, that if it dredges a Ceaseless Expanse, that gives you 100 armor. The perfect counter. I'd love to see this, and I'm sure we'll get a screenshot of this at some point, of Igneous Lava Gorger dredging up a Ceaseless Expanse. You get 100 armor, and a Paladin Holy wrathing the 100 armor off again. Very funny, very memey. Fortunately, in Standard, we don't really have these big effects, although I say that, there's one pretty big example of it. Pendant of the Earth is one of the cards that immediately sprung to mind with this. If you draw Ceaseless Expanse with Pendant of Earth, it's effectively a full heal, right, for Druid or Priest. Realistically, neither of those decks are going to get beyond 30 max health, although funnily enough, right now, and this won't quite overlap, Renathal is in the core set, but I think when this new set comes in, Renathal will rotate out, so you won't get 40 health off this, ever, I believe, unless you play Wild. It's just going to be, well, not 30 health, but you know what it's going to be, like 29 health, if you're very skillful with it, or very lucky. The other card, though, that I think people will definitely do, and I am people, how about Black Rock and Roll? If you put your Ceaseless Expanse in your Black Rock and Roll warrior deck, Ceaseless Expanse becomes a 100 mana, 115, 115. The first triple digit minion in the game. My gut feeling is this is going to be too memey. It's going to be too slow, too many steps to set up, too inconsistent as well. It requires you to draw Black Rock and Roll and not draw Ceaseless Expanse. It then requires you to play the Ceaseless Expanse at some point, which is going to take some time. And then also that your opponent can't deal with a 115 at 115. I know that sounds stupid, but obviously, if this became a thing, people would put Assassinate-like cards in their deck to deal with the Ceaseless Expanse, or some sort of, like, poisonous minion in the deck. So I just don't see it, but I'm certainly going to try and meme out with this and get the 115 stat line. Also worth noting, I did say it's a bit inconsistent, though there are some cards existing in Standard right now that draw the highest cost card. Obviously, Ceaseless Expanse will be the highest cost card in your deck. So if you want to put this in your Paladin deck, you could Grill Master it. More realistically, if this was a really, really important and impactful card, you can use Talon, which is a neutral card that every other class can use, to draw your Ceaseless Expanse. Also, you could Dorian this card as well. I talked about using Marin to turn it into a 0 mana card, which obviously is fantastic. But if you hit this with Dorian on top of your Talon and turn one of these into a 1 copy of it, obviously you remove the threat of this just being like a lethal card. But 1 mana 1/1 destroy all of the minions in a control deck is actually pretty welcome to allow you to get to this late game to play your big Ceaseless Expanse instead. We'll say watch the space in this card, but I think my gut feeling right now, without seeing the entire set and just knowing how Standard is right now, that this card is just going to be simply too slow. I think it's just going to end up being a meme card. I'd love it to not be, but that's where I think it's going to be. The other legendary we got shown was the Exodar. 8 mana, 6/10. Battlecry. If you're building a starship, launch it and choose a protocol. The protocols are on the right here. There is emergency repairs, gain armor equal to your starship's health twice, offensive formation, deal damage equal to your starship's attack randomly split between all enemies, and then crew transport, which is get copies of all the star pieces that we use to make the starship, and you set their cost to 1. This card, I see it as almost like a Reno analog, that if starships are strong, the Exodar will be strong. Similar to like Reno, if your Highlander deck was strong, Reno would be like very strong. It actually turned out with Reno that they pushed the mechanic more because Reno was so strong that it kind of incentivized you to play the Highlander deck for it rather than the classes, you know, Highlander cards. In most situations, that is. Exodar, on its own, obviously not great. 8 mana, 8/8 stat lines, which isn't what it is. It's 8 mana, 6/10, but it's 16 stats, okay, for 8 mana. Not a great deal in Standard nowadays. The protocols, though, are actually pretty good. Gain armor equal to your ship's health twice. Again, but until we see all the starship pieces, it's kind of hard to evaluate this. But I kind of see this towards being something like maybe 10 to 24 armor type effect. A bit hand-wavy, because it also depends on whether or not you're just going to curve out Exodar or you're going to build the perfect starship, so to speak. Generally speaking, games don't last too long, or at least in my experience, they haven't been lasting too long recently, so I don't think you'll have the opportunity to build this ginormous starship. If you're just playing this on curve, I think you're going to be closer towards this 10 to 12 armor range, which, by the way, is really good into an aggro matchup, to just suddenly gain 12 armor. Offensive formation, I kind of see it again, this is going to be around this 10 to 12 damage range. It's hard to say until we see all the starship pieces. As I said, all the pieces we've seen so far have been severely understated for the costs. Actually, huge tempo losses on playing these pieces. So my gut feeling is this was intentional because of the Exodar to like curve it in a little bit. So 8 mana, 6/10, get these effects. Not too bad, right? Crew transport is get the starship pieces back, set the cost to 1. How many starship pieces are you going to play before 8? I'd probably say, again, gut feeling, you're looking at like 2 to 3 pieces. So you're getting 3 cards setting their cost to 1, but I think it's going to be typically 3 fairly understated cards. So, again, I'm not sure of the quality of this. Just again to like try and drive this home, I tried to find like real world card examples of the protocols. Cenarian Ward, which I don't think saw a lot of playing Druid from what I remember, was gain 8 armor at 8 mana and summon an 8 cost minion. 8 mana, 16 stats is almost akin to a random 8-drop minion. And I think Cenarian Ward would actually give you less armor than the Exodar will actually give you. So I think Exodar is better than Cenarian Ward, but I don't think that's saying a lot. Astalor was the classic card that dealt a lot of damage spread amongst enemy minions. This card was so good that you had to put 2 steps in the process to get to this card. But this card was insane. Now, this did it did 14 damage for 8 mana. I mentioned, and again, we can't really see this out. I think the protocol will do fairly close to 14, but I think it will, generally speaking, be under the 14 damage that you got from Astalor. So I think it's going to be worse than Astalor on the protocol side of things. And then finally, on drawing cards, Alexstrasza, which was a 9 mana card, not an 8 mana card, gave you 2 random dragons that cost you 0. Now, your deck had to have no duplicates, that was the requirement. This effect was extremely strong. It's not too dissimilar from getting potentially what I think is going to be 3 cards that cost 1. That being said, do I want 2 dragons that are 0 costs or 3 Starship pieces that cost 1? Depends on the pieces. If the pieces are like combo enablers or there's like some value inherently to them, maybe the pieces can outvalue the dragons, but from what I've seen so far, I think a random dragon is going to be better than a Starship piece, and I think 2 random dragons will be better than 3 random Starship pieces. But again, this is hand wavy right now. Now, you might be pointing out, I am missing one big thing about this card, which kind of separates it from all of these other things. It launches the Starship as well, and whatever you want to say about these Starships, the value of the cards, that effect is locked as a 5 mana effect. So at the very least, if Starships are good, then the Exodar kind of bundles on a 5 mana discount at the very least. Obviously, it depends on how good the Starship is at that point of the game. I think all in all, when you package all of these things together and all of the stats and all of the mana discounts, I actually think the Exodar is a really strong card, and if Starship decks are going to work, the Exodar is going to be one of the things that pushes this to like the highest of high levels. But again, it's just too early to say until we see all the Starships and exactly how they function. From the few I've seen so far, I think Starships won't work because they're just too slow. But obviously, they're saving the best to last, right? They've only shown us some of the neutral Starships. That's fine. Anyway, if Starships are strong, we have got a tech card to answer them. It is Star Vulpera. 5 mana 4/5 tradable minion. Battlecry, destroy an enemy Starship or Starship piece. Key thing to note about this card, by the way, is the Starship that is building on the board isn't a Starship or a Starship piece, so the Star Vulpera cannot target it. It can only target the launch Starship or the pieces of them that they play onto the board. Okay, to evaluate this card, obviously 4/5 for 5 mana is a very understated minion. Destroy an enemy minion is Assassinate, that's a 4 mana spell. Assassinate sees no play, so realistically, it's probably closer to like a 3 mana-ish effect. Also, it's worse than Assassinate because it's a very finite pool of cards that it can assassinate. We've seen cards like this in Standard in the past, and for the most part, they don't see any play. Stuff like Hemet, where it was Destroy a Beast, EMP Operative destroyed mechs. Black Knight did actually see little bits of play in earlier Hearthstone to kill the Lich King. That was destroying an enemy minion with Taunt. And a Big Game Hunter destroys a minion with 7 or more attack. This, again, is a very classic Hearthstone card and did see some play back in like the classic sets of Hearthstone. However, would any of these cards see play currently in Standard? No, not really. I don't think so. They're just too specific. And actually, Vulpera is way, way too specific. Now, obviously, if Starships are really, really, really strong, Vulpera will see play, just to be able to explode someone's Starship. That being said, I think there are going to be better ways to just destroy a minion, so I'm not convinced that Star Vulpera will make any of these decks. One thing it does have as an advantage for it, because clearly this is a tech card, because if your opponent doesn't play a Starship deck, and not every class will have Starships, by the way, in case you're not aware, it's 5 mana 4/5, which is real bad tempo loss. It has got tradable on it though, so you could get a scenario where you just never play this card and you just keep spending that 1 mana to put it back into your deck again, and just forget that you ever had it. Also, it may be a card that you just throw into an ETC, for example, if you're a value deck, and you just pick that card when you go up against a really annoying Starship deck. And by the way, I think you're most likely going to be hitting this on the Starship and not the pieces. It's going to be very specifically a tech card that targets one specific minion, so it really just depends on the quality of the Starships as to whether this will see play. Again, reminder, these are the only Starship pieces we've seen so far: the Arcanite Defense Crystal, the Starlight Reactor, and Dimensional Core. Do I think playing 5 mana 4/5 destroy one of these cards, aka the Starship piece on the board, is worth it? No, not really. It's not bad, obviously, in effect, but these cards are all pretty weak. Maybe with the exception of the Starlight Reactor, until we see all the arcane spells that Druid can have access to. We don't really know the value of this quantity, but generally speaking, the Arcanite Defense Crystal and the Dimensional Core, they're really, really weak cards. There are better plays to make than just play 5 mana 4/5, destroy it. There are so many stronger 5 cost cards, so I don't see it. And actually, if Starships become a huge issue, I think more people are inclined to play Reno, because Reno can destroy the Starship before it's even launched. It can break the launch pad, so to speak. So yeah, I think you're more likely to see Reno decks than Star Vulpera decks. Okay, now we get to some interesting cards. I guess all of them are interesting, but this one in particular, because I think this might see some play. Red Giant, an 8 mana 8/8 elemental, costs 1 less for each adjacent card played while in hand. Obviously, this card, you don't want to mulligan it on the left side of your hand, because it reduces the amount of cards that you can play to discount this by 1. And that's a pretty big deal for this card. It does approach as well this question of how good does a card have to be to play in Standard if it just has big stats? Because obviously 8 mana 8/8, that won't see play in Standard. 7 mana 8/8 in Standard with no effect probably doesn't see play. 6 mana, now you're starting to like wet my whistle a little bit, and that's kind of where I see this Red Giant. And actually one of the really nice things about Red Giant compared to maybe something like Arcane Giant, which has a somewhat similar effect based on playing cards from hand to discount it, is it starts at 8 mana. Like, I think you only need to hit this twice with discount, so play 2 cards adjacent to the Red Giant during the course of a game, and playing this as a 6 mana 8/8 is probably good enough, to be honest with you. If you can get it at 5, and I think some decks realistically can get this at 5, that is going to be really frightening. 5 mana 8/8, not very bueno to play against. And by the way, there are some tempo decks out there that like elementals. That's right, Elemental Mage and Elemental Shaman. They run Azurite Giant, which gets a reduction for every turn in a row you played an elemental. That also starts at this 8 mana stat line. Now, I think it's easier to play an elemental each turn than play an adjacent card to Red Giant every single turn, but it's not going to be unreasonable in these elemental decks, which are going to have pretty low curves, and you're going to be playing a card every single turn, to expect you to hit 2 or so discounts on the Red Giant, I think. At which point, you could probably play your Azurite Giant into your Red Giant for some real big stuff. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Pain package, but without dealing with the Pain aspect of it. It probably comes up a little bit later than that package, but it's still going to be a big tempo swing to drop an Azurite Giant and a Red Giant onto the board at like the same time, for example. Also worth noting, there are some other decks that maybe tried to make this Red Giant work. There are Paladin decks out there, which the intention of it is to play a lot of cheap spells. For example, some sort of Rayla Mage Paladin deck, which exploits the cheap spells, the sunscreens, and so on and so forth. And maybe you could fill your hand with like a bunch of cheap cards and just machine gun fire them off at some point to get the Red Giant to get a big discount on it. One nice thing as well is if you can put and I've put Divine Brew here for the reason, if you can put a drink next to the Red Giant, the second drink that is left will be next to the Red Giant, so having like a Divine Brew next to your Red Giant is effectively a 3 mana discount. It is for 3 mana, but, you know, getting an extra upside to your Divine Brews, very nice. There is a world as well where maybe Rogue tries to do something with this with like coin strategies, because obviously playing Divine Brews costs 1 mana, coins cost 0 mana. In fact, it's, I guess, negative 1 mana in a sense that you get a mana crystal back. Perhaps you fill your hand with a bunch of coins, try and get a Red Giant in between all of these coins, and you start vomiting out coins, and try and get this Red Giant out early. I don't think this will work, but maybe if you're trying to play some coin rogue deck, perhaps you'll try and use this as some other value add, just in case you don't draw Wishing Well. We also have another elemental in the form of Moonstone Mauler, 2 mana 2/2. Battle Cry, shuffle 3 asteroids into your deck that deal 2 damage to a random enemy when drawn. It's very much cut from the same cloth as stuff like Faldori Strider or Portal Keeper, for example. Both of these are understated minions for their mana cost, and their effect is also, if you're just playing this as an effect that wasn't on a cast when drawn, it's understated for the mana cost you're paying for the card. But obviously, if you could get all of them drawn very quickly, then 2 mana deal 6 damage is obviously, with a 2/2, is really, really good. Even though it's random, it would probably have seen some play. This all being said and good, the effect is extremely minor, and I think when you have these cast when drawn effects, you want a big impact on the card drawn effect to make up for the fact that you've effectively paid the mana way in advance. The longer and longer you wait to get the benefit of this, the weaker and weaker it gets, the more diluted the effect gets. And honestly, the Moonstone Maulers, 2 damage is kind of like a 1 mana-ish effect. And dare I say, a stat line of 2/2 is probably a 1 mana minion. So you're actually paying a pretty big tempo loss to play this Moonstone Mauler, and you're getting extremely minor effects, especially later in the game. You get to 10 mana crystals and you get an effect that is like 1 mana-ish. It's just a drop in the ocean, really. Obviously, there are things you can do with this. Shaman can do Battle Cry shenanigans with it with Shudder Block. Turbulence would also hit this card because it has a Battle Cry. However, you're probably better just putting Incendious in your deck instead with the Shudder Block, which does way more damage, also hits your opponent's board, which is very much more frustrating, and you shuffle more of them into your deck, so you're more likely to draw the Eruptions. I just think Moonstone Mauler is just blown out the water by Incendious. You could also see a world where you put it into your, like, Highlander Warrior deck to shuffle 6 Asteroids into your deck. I just don't see it, though. It's just, again, a drop in the ocean of value. Why go through all the effort to put a Highlander deck together to play Bran on 8, to then play a Moonstone Mauler to get you an additional 6 random damage over the course of the game? It just simply isn't worth it. I actually think the only place this card would have seen some play was in Elemental Rogue, but Elemental Rogue is, like, dropped off a cliff. And the only reason that would have seen play in that deck, maybe, was that they were just putting any elemental in that deck effectively that was a neutral card, and this is a neutral elemental. It's relatively okay, but yeah, this won't see any play, I think, in Standard. A spicy meatball of a card, though, that maybe some people will test out. Splitting Space Rock, 8 mana, 8/8 elemental. Death Rattle, summon 2, 4/4 splitting Boulders. You might be saying, why do I think this is spicy? Well, splitting Boulders, they have Death Rattle, summon 2/2 splitting stones. What are splitting stones? They have Death Rattle, summon 2 1/1 pebbles. And then the pebbles are just 1/1s with no Death Rattle on them. All in all, when you total this all together, I think it works out as 8 mana, 32 stat lines. Going back again to, you know, I pay a mana cost, I get a stat line. What point does this see play in Standard? If you had an 8 mana 32, that would see play in Standard, so maybe this card sees play in Standard. Now, obviously, that's not the way this card works. It is this slow burning value over time. And actually, we've seen a card very similar to this, but obviously a lot weaker. This is Splitting Fester Roots type effect. Now, this was an 8 mana 4/4, and it only nested 3 times, not 4 times. So you only got 12/12 right in stat lines for this card. This card wasn't good enough. It didn't really see any play. Space Rock, on the other hand, though, 8 mana 8/8 is obviously a big tempo loss play. It's a very weak effect. However, if you live through that turn, you have got the promise of 32 stat lines in the future. And if you're some sort of like tempo-y mid-rangey deck and you just want to smoke your opponent down, this thing is going to be a nightmare to remove. This is like the stickiest of sticky minions you could imagine in the game. But the key of this will be living during the turn you play the 8 mana 8/8. It's such a big tempo loss now compared to what other decks can do. I'm not sure about it. There are some other things you can do with this card. Death Knight has a Death Rattle package. You could try and Buccaneer this to give it Reborn, to give you effectively, I don't know exactly what the math works out as this as. It's like 32-25 stat lines, right? You just lose the 7 health from the Reborn minion. At that point, though, you're probably going to start losing some additional value, as if your opponent breaks all the rocks and there's no board space, you won't get those minions. So I think this is too much of a pipe dream. You could also Death Growl, and again, you will be losing value, almost certainly. That being said, your opponent is probably not going to be able to remove it by conventional means, so to speak. Perhaps Demon Hunters as well try and humor this card. You play your return policy, you discover a Death Rattle, you play this game, you hit the Splitting Space Rock, and you instantly for 3 mana get 2 4/4s and a Splitting Space Rock in your hand. Again, I think this is too fair, personally speaking. What might not be too fair, though, is if you can set up some sort of Thunderbringer deck, because this is an elemental, and you cheat out the Splitting Space Rock with a big beast as well. There are some classes that would like to use Thunderbringer to cheat out big beasts, however don't have an elemental card to put into that deck. There were also the vice versa effects where there were decks that liked big elementals in their class, but didn't have the big beasts to go with it. Splitting Space Rock could fill this niche, though, for the beast side of things that want a big elemental in the deck. Because if you cheat this out with Thunderbringer, that's a pretty spooky proposition. You've already had to deal with, like, the Thunderbringer. He's then summoned something else out. This minion then summons something else out. That summons something else out. That summons something else out. You're basically guaranteed to be taking damage, and a lot of it every single turn. So yeah, horrible card to deal with. And then finally, if you hit this with Mezzadune from Mage, really frightening, because obviously half the stat line of this, you turn it into a 4-mana 4/4. However, the Death Rattle stays the same, so you trade 4/4, aka 8 stat lines from your 32/32, and you get 2 copies of it instead. That's a pretty good deal, especially if you can play Mezzadune and then play the Splitting Space Rock on 6. You do have 2 mana left over then as well. That's not a big tempo loss anymore, playing a 4-mana 4/4 that Death Rattles into many 4/4s. It's much easier to deal with that earlier than later. Just one final thing I'll say about this card is, one of the other cards I thought of, and this was actually kind of during the preparation of this presentation, was Rattlegore. Rattlegore was like this classic warrior card. I think it was an 8/8, right? I can't remember if it was 8 mana or 9 mana, but it's by the by. It was a big 8/8 that death rattled, and you resummed it with -1/1 on the stat lines. It's kind of similar to a Rattlegore effect, where it's a minion that could just stay on the board and keep smoking things. I will say I think Rattlegore has a small advantage over it in the sense that you kind of like this big beat stick to hit other beat sticks in some sort of controlling matchup. Also, the time has sort of like changed now. Would Rattlegore see play now compared to the past? I'm not completely certain, so this is a really watch this space card. I think it won't see play. I think it's just going to be too slow, but if you can cheat this out, if you can get this on the board early, it's extremely frightening. Okay, we'll get through this one quickly. This is a meme card. 3 mana 2/5 elemental. Perplexing Anomaly. Rush, Taunt, Stealth? Alright, in case you're wondering, because some people are questioning why does it say ... stealth ? This has nothing to do with, like, do you get stealth or do you not get stealth? The idea of this card is that having a minion with rush and stealth is effectively pointless, because as soon as you rush, you break the stealth. Similarly, there's no point in having taunt and stealth on a minion, because minions with stealth can't be taunted. So that is why it's perplexing. It's because it's 3 different keywords that don't synergize exactly with one another. Except for rush and taunt, which we have seen in the past with Hippogriff. That's kind of how I treat this card. I think it's going to be 3 mana 2/5 rush taunt, because you're probably not going to leave in stealth mode without taunt, because then you're playing a 3 mana 2/5 stealth, which is pretty bad for even classic Hearthstone, so this card is just a complete meme. Compared to Hippogriff, which saw 0 play, it is better statted by like 1 stat. Is it good enough to see any play in Standard? No. So, unless some really weird memey situation comes out where a card says an effect like, if this minion has stealth, you know, do something with it, Perplexing Anomaly will just see 0 play. There are better elementals out there. The elemental synergy, I think, is fairly weak on it, so... Or the tribe tag on it's pretty weak for it. This is just pack filler. Alright, what isn't pack filler, at least, I think it's going under the radar a little bit based on the Twitter mentions for this card, is Ace Wayfinder. 5 mana 5/5 Draenei? I'll keep calling Draenies or Draenais. Who knows? Battlecry. Gain 2 random bonus effects. The next Draenei you play gains them as well. Not a lot of people were mentioning this card on the interwebs. They were probably too interested in the legendaries, but I think this is low-key a pretty strong card. It reminds me a lot of Fossilized Kaleidosaur. In that card had Battlecry gain 2 random bonus effects, and rather than giving your next minion a same deal, 2 bonus effects, you excavated a treasure instead. Fossilized Kaleidosaur was also understated compared to Ace Wayfinder. They're both understated for their mana cost, of course, because the effect is fairly strong. What value would I give to random bonus effects? And just in case you're not aware, the random bonus effects in the game right now are Taunt, Wind Fury, Divine Shield, Poisonous, Elusive, Rush, Lifesteal, or Reborn. Obviously, not all of these effects are made equally to others. I would generally speaking say like gaining a bonus effect is about a half mana effect, so bundling it together, it's about a 1 mana effect on it. So you could sort of see Ace Wayfinder as being like a 4 mana 5/5 stat line instead if you just discounted the effect off it. Which actually isn't terrible, but probably still wouldn't have seen play in Standard. That being said, you do get the additional 1 mana discount in the future again, but obviously, as I said before, discounting something in the future, getting like that mana cheat in the future, normally gets diluted to some degree. It's not quite as valuable as like the fast acting effect of it. So obviously, all in all, this card, I think excavating a treasure typically would be more value than getting 2 additional bonus effects on another minion. However, And by the way, Fossilized Kaleidoscope didn't really see any play, but that was partially because Handbuff Paladin is a monster of a deck, so it couldn't find a niche in that realm. It's still a pretty good card, I think. One thing we don't really know yet, and we're still trying to learn, is how good are Draenei. Specifically, how good are the Draenei going to be with bonus effects on them. If they have got some way to improve the bonus effect, like they have some other fast-acting effect on top of them, suddenly Ace Wayfinder becomes considerably better. And we have seen a card like this. Archwing Pilot for Mage. What if you give this card Poisonous, for example? Suddenly the 3 damage you do to a random enemy, assuming it doesn't hit the face, if it hits a minion, will kill it, regardless of the stat line. It could be a 115, 115, 115, or what we were talking about earlier. The Archwing Pilot will go pew 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 pew, and the Arc Core Reactor thing will explode, and so will the minion. Probably even more frightening for Archwing Pilot, you could hit this with Reborn. And there's actually multiple reasons why the Reborn is really scary on this card. Obviously, the effect is pretty strong on this card, especially if you can keep the Spell Burst on it. Realistically, you're probably going to burn the Spell Burst off the first Archwing Pilot, so you're not going to be able to like protect it behind like Divine Shield or something, because you'll hit the Spell Burst, create a new one, and that one won't have the bonus effect on it. If though you hit the first one with Reborn, if the Archwing Pilot dies, it will come back with the Spell Burst effect available again. And then you could Spell Burst that again and just keep getting endless supplies of Pilot. So I actually think some of these keywords are really frightening with the Pilot. Specifically Reborn, Divine Shield, and Poisons. I think they're all fairly frightening. To some degree as well, you could argue that Elusive is somewhat of a protective effect on these cards, but they have such low health that you could probably trade it out with a minion fairly easily. Lifesteal is also a minor nice get, but it's still only get 3 health, which is fairly minor. But if you hit any of the other ones, and by the way, you're getting 2 of these, so it's a... Oh my god, this is going to be the... I should have done the math before! You're getting like a 25% chance to hit any effect, right? It's slightly higher on the second roll because it's only 7 choices, because a keyword can't hit a keyword. But you've got a not insignificant chance. It's not a 1 in 8, let's put it that way. It's going to be somewhere around like... I guess it's about 25 to 35% chance that you're going to hit one of Divine Shield, Lifesteal, or Reborn. Someone smarter than me can work out the maths, and by Lifesteal I meant Poisonous. Divine Shield, Poisonous, and Reborn. You'll hit one of those. Also worth noting, Adaptive Amalgam. That is going to be a Draenei, and I talked about this in the past or the previous video I suppose, with this new tribe. It suddenly means Adaptive Amalgam can get hit by this tribe's effects as well, and we'll see this again in the future of this episode. One of the weaknesses of the Adaptive Amalgam decks was actually trying to give the Adaptive Amalgam Rush. Because without Rush, you can make it as big as you want, but your opponent will always have the chance first to deal with your minion, versus you getting to get the benefit of having this big guy. What would be nice, though, is if you play your Ace Wayfinder into your Adaptive Amalgam, you've got a decent chance to hit Rush. It's a 25% chance to hit Rush. And it's actually higher than that if you can put other keywords on it instead. Like if you can give this thing Wind Fury, if you can give this thing Taunt, suddenly then you're looking at a 2 in 7 chance or a 2 in 6 chance. You know, not crazy odds to hit the Rush on this. And if you can hit this with Rush and Lifesteal, suddenly the Adaptive Amalgam is actually frightening, because every single time you play one of these things, they're going to hit big stats into one of your minions and then just heal back up again to full. So that is the dream with Adaptive Amalgams, to hit big stats, Rush, Lifesteal. And Ace Wayfinder gives you the opportunity to do this. Do I think this package will all work together? No, I think it's still going to be too slow, to be honest with you, but people will test this out again. Also, we have seen some other Draenei now. Hologram Operator, 2 mana 3/2 Draenei. Battlecry, get 3 temporary Draenei. Thank you for making me say Draenei 3 times, by the way, card. This card reminds me of Sweet and Snow Flurry. Sweet and Snow Flurry sees 0 play. It gives you 2 random temporary Frost cards, and actually it's kind of more than that, in a sense that it gives you the mini, which is a 1 mana 1/1 version of it, that gives you another 2 temporary Frost spells. So all in all, you could treat this as like a 4 mana 4/4, get 4 temporary cards, which as a stat line is worse than the Hologram Operator. However, I don't really know yet until we see the entire set. Is a temporary Frost spell better than a temporary Draenei? One of the weaknesses of the Sweet and Snow Flurry is obviously you don't really want to play this on 3, because there's a lot of Frost spells you can't play for 0 mana. Funnily enough, there are some Frost spells you can play for 0 mana, and indeed, when I did run this card in some decks, I did play this card on curve sometimes at 3 with the hope to hit the 0 mana refresh 2 mana crystals, and occasionally I hit it, but it was fairly inconsistent, as you can imagine. But anyway, you normally want to play this later into the game, and playing a 3 mana 3/3 get a temporary frost spell isn't that great later into the game. Similarly, Hologram Operator, you're probably going to have to play this later into the game, because you're not going to be able to play the temporary Draenei. We've seen a few Draenei now, and a lot of the ones we've seen are actually fairly high cost. So you're going to need like the full additional mana cost to play those cards. I'd probably say you're going to be playing this around like 9 to 10 mana, which is just too slow, too inconsequential. The stat line 2 mana 3/2 is fine, but not fantastic. It's just not going to work, I think. Stranded Spaceman, another Draenei, 2 mana 2/3. Battlecry, the next Draenei you play gains +2 health and rush. Actually very similar to Fanboy, which was a 2 mana 2/2. That gave 2 attack and rush as one of its keywords. That is probably a better scenario than what you get on the Stranded Spaceman. It's kind of weird that it gives you health and rush. It means that the minion that you rush in is more likely to survive. So you could probably want like an aura on your next Draenei you play, which is probably fairly unlikely considering most of the Draenei's we've seen have Battle Cries or Death Rattles. I don't think this is going to be classed as too many like aura-like effects. But yeah, it maybe allows another minion to live. Giving another minion rush, by the way, is actually pretty good tempo play if you're playing minion v minion combat. The card's actually pretty good for that, so I don't think this is a bad card by any stretch of the imagination, but Fanboy sees 0 play, and it gives 2 attack and rush, which means that the next minion the minion you have on the board can trade more favorably. If you have like a 1-drop on the board, your opponent plays a 3-drop, you play Fanboy on your 1-drop, your 1-drop could trade into their 3-drop, probably with the +2 attack even. Stranded Spaceman probably doesn't help the trade per se, other than your minion might live through it, so I think it's a pretty weak card. It might see play just to fill out the curve depending on all the other Draenei we see. Who knows? Oh, by the way, we've also not seen any 3-drops yet for the Draenei, so there are some cards that are going to be retrofitted with this tag, and I think Imic tweeted out about it. I don't know what his source is other than the fact that it's a Hearthstone journalist, so he probably knows. But I don't think there were many 3-drops from the other cards as well that exist in Stand that are going to get this Draenei tag as well. So it really depends. If there's a good 3-drop printed and you want to keep it alive, or if it has like a really high attack and really low health and you want to keep it alive, maybe you put Spaceman in that deck as like a tempo curve. You might also want to put this onto like your ace Wayfinder, for example, because giving this rush when it gets 2 random bonus effects is pretty nice. Especially since it'll mean that one of the random bonus effects you get from the Ace Wayfinder won't be rushed because you can't hit the same keyword with a bonus effect card. That being said, there's a pretty big gap between 2 and 5. Do you really want to play your Stranded Spaceman on 4? Probably not, but you have to bear in mind these types of effects, especially if you get more Draenei with gain bonus effect type deals. Another one we saw as well is Troubled Mechanic. 2 mana 2/1 Draenei, Divine Shield, Spellburst, draw a Draenei. Reminds me very much of High-Ho Silverwing, which has seen some play in recent times. That was also a 2 mana 2/1. It was a dragon instead of a Draenei. Had Divine Shield, however this had a Death Rattle and drew a Holy Spell. Troubled Mechanic is Spellburst to draw a Draenei instead. Which one is better? Actually, it's very hand-wavy. It's kind of hard to fully evaluate it. It's sort of dependent on the scenarios. If you're curving this card out, High-Ho Silverwing is probably better, because you're almost certainly going to get the Death Rattle effect off, right? It's not going to be silence. In fact, there's not a lot of silence in Hearthstone right now. It's unlikely someone's going to steal this, because the Death Rattle's not particularly good for your opponent unless they have a Holy Spell in their deck, which is actually a pretty restrictive requirement for most decks, since Holy is like the keyword for Priest and Paladin almost exclusively. Troubled Mechanics draw a Draenei is probably going to be fairly narrow, but not quite as narrow as the Holy Spell. So this card could be stolen. Also, if it's killed, then you're not going to get the effect off it. If you're playing this on curve, you're probably going to struggle to Spellburst it. You're probably going to have to Spellburst it the turn afterwards, which means there is a chance that you play this as 2 mana 2/1 Divine Shield, which obviously is not good enough in Standard. Now, if these Draenei decks, and again, we won't know the full picture until we see the full set, have some cheap spell support, then maybe Troubled Mechanic will see play in those decks, because 2 mana 2/1 Divine Shield, draw a card, actually is a reasonable effect. I think it's good enough to see some play in a deck. So this won't be like a key card, but I see a world where this sees some play. It just depends on the whole situation. If it's like a very tempo-orientated deck, like the Elemental Shaman decks are, they don't run too many spells in that deck, so kind of by proxy, I'm going to assume that the Draenei deck won't run too many spells, in which case the spell burst is going to be hard, in which case the card won't see any play, but I don't know the full picture yet, okay? So that's my piece on this card. Oh, by the way, one of the things that you might use this for in case, instead of using it in these Draenei decks, is to find an Adaptive Amalgam. If you run one of these Adaptive Amalgam decks, you often ran tutor cards, and this is definitely a tutor card, in those decks to find you, like, for example, a beast or an elemental. Because obviously, an amalgam is all of the tribes, so any card that says, like, draw a tribe will hit the Adaptive Amalgam. If you put Troubled Mechanic in that deck, and that deck probably is more likely to run multiple spells in it, you could use Troubled Mechanic just to pull out the Amalgam very specifically, and there's probably not too big an overlap between other Draenei, or other cards in that deck, so to speak, I suppose, because the Draenei tribe is so new. There are so few cards that are going to have that tribe on it. In which case, you don't have the situation where, like, you can't put beasts in your Adaptive Amalgam deck, because otherwise your tutor beast card would hit the beast and not the amalgam. That's kind of like the scenario I see for this Troubled Mechanic. Maybe it just becomes a tutor for Adaptive Amalgam instead, which, you know, in its own right might be nice. Do I still think that sees play in any of these decks? I'm not sure. The only Adaptive Amalgam deck I'm aware that is really seeing any sort of play right now is the Rogue Mech version of it. And that deck is very memey. I don't even know if it's tier 3. It's like around tier 3, tier 4. They do run spells in that deck, so conceivably the mechanic maybe sees some play in it, but I'm not too sure. Maybe it's going to be too many like hoops to jump through. We also get another amalgam, by the way. Mutating Lifeform. 5 mana, 3/8 all. Tribe. After this survives damage, gain a random bonus effect. Okay, we've seen a lot of these like Enrage type cards before. We actually have one currently in Standard right now, Botface, which sees 0 play. In part because the class that, you know, the classic Enrage class is Warrior, and there's actually not a lot of great Enrage cards in there. Sure, there's stuff like Aftershocks, which could hit your own minion to give you, you know, 3 triggers of the Mutating Lifeform. You also have Bladestorm, that if you play your Mutating Lifeform into a Bladestorm and your opponent's got a pretty, pardon me, big minion on the board, you could get this Mutating Lifeform to trigger like 5 or so bonus effects onto the card. Do I think any of these hoops are worth jumping through? Not really, no. To be completely honest with you, so I don't see a world where this sees any play right now. As I said, giving a random bonus effect, not all bonus effects are made equally, so to speak. I kind of see it as like a half mana-ish effect. Is it worth spending like a 1 mana card on getting a half mana effect? Generally speaking, no. You want some other value with your Enrage mechanic. There are some things like the location for Warrior, whose name's completely escaping me right now. The Sanguine Courtyard, or whatever it's called, the Sanguine House. That gives your minion +2 attack as well as doing an Enrage mechanic, so that would be nice with the Mutating Lifeform as well, but simply I don't think the archetype is quite there for it. Maybe this implies though the archetype is going to be there for it. Oh, just as a complete sidestep, I should have said this at the start of the introduction. Every card for this expansion, by the way, has been leaked at some point on Twitter, on Reddit and Twitter, I suppose. So if you want to get the full like experience of the reveals, avoid r/Hearthstone right now, because every card has been revealed. So I haven't seen any of these, I don't know the cards. I'm going to assume without the knowledge of this that they may be trying to push an Enrage mechanic, and maybe this is why Botface was also printed, that they knew an Enrage set was coming up for Warrior. Maybe Mutating Lifeform gets into that deck, but even still, I just struggle to see a world where like a 3, let's say you hit this 5 times with Enrage stuff, a 3/3 with 5 bonus effects for 5 mana sees play. 3/3 stat lines is probably like a 2 mana-ish effect. The bonus effects all bundled together is probably worth like 2.5-ish mana at that point, which comes out as less than 5. I know when you bundle cards together, they get better as well, so having 5 bonus effects on a 3/3 actually could be pretty powerful. You're approaching like Ziliax levels of cards. You could get like Rush, Divine Shield, Reborn, Lifesteal, and that type of scenario. I just don't see it though. It's also worth noting as well, without buffing this card, you can't get every bonus effect on the card, as there are 8 bonus effects and this only has 8 health, so you need to buff the card to get every bonus effect. There are ways to do that, of course. You could magnetize this because it is a amalgam, aka it is a mech. You could put this in hand buff Death Knight because it's an undead. It is an elemental, so Starazane would double it as well. And similarly, it's a beast, so Messenger Buzzard could hit it if you were going to try and run some sort of hand buff Hunter deck, which they did try to push as a mechanic. All in all, though, I just think this card is not unfair enough for Standard nowadays. We also saw another demon in Maiden, 4 mana 4/4 demon, battlecry, draw a card from your opponent's deck. If you don't play it this turn, put it back. This card is pretty garbage in my opinion. It's kind of like Benevolent Banker, but you don't get the permanency of the effect of Benevolent Banker. Now, I do appreciate to get the permanency effect of Benevolent Banker, you have to quick draw it, which in its own right is somewhat hard. That being said, quick drawing a 3 mana minion is normally fairly easy to do. It is a pretty big tempo loss though to play a 2/4 on for 3 mana. It's fairly understated. Obviously the intention of Maiden is to be a combo breaker, something similar to like a Theatar. Obviously this card is nowhere near good as Theatar, because again Theatar was permanency on the card. Also, Theatar looks in your opponent's hand rather than your deck, which is again a pretty important thing. If you can deny your opponent a card in their hand, it's better than denying them a card in their deck. Now, Theatar didn't deny the card, it swapped it out, but you could effectively deny it by putting a bad card from your hand into your opponent's hand instead, or at least a card that wouldn't work in their deck. Also worth noting that Maiden, you have to have the mana to play the card, otherwise you don't steal it. So you're probably not playing this on curve. Now, I did see that some people point out, and this is true, the card that you draw is the top card of your opponent's deck, which means at the very least this is 4 mana 4/4, look at the top card of your opponent's deck. But that wouldn't see play in Standard, so I just don't see it. You're going to have to play this at like 10 mana. If the top card of your opponent's deck is worth more than 6 mana, you can't play it, so you can't steal it. The only world this card sees any play is in some sort of tech deck, which is a combo deck, which puts a card specifically on the top of the opponent's deck that costs less than 6 and is part of a combo. It's just not going to happen, so. And even if that happens, it won't go in the deck, it'll go into like an ETC or something, because again, it doesn't have tradable, so it's a really bad card to draw. It's 4 mana 4/4 for the most part. Just terrible. Terrible, terrible, terrible. That being said, on whole, well and good, there are some weird scenarios with this card. Watch out for this in stuff like Window Shopper, for example. If you get one of these as a 1 mana 1/1 copy instead, then it becomes a little bit more frightening because you're more likely to be able to play the card that your opponent steals. Also, the Window Shopper deck allows you to discover a lot of demons, and this set seems to be a set that is going to be a lot of discovering demons. So there is a world where Maiden becomes an extremely good card to discover, but I don't think it's ever going to be a good card to put in your deck. And I think it's only a good card to discover if you get some other juice on top of the discovery, like you give it some additional stats or you give it a mana discount. Then I can see some world where you just start stealing your opponent's deck. And maybe that's why people are kind of like, this seems very weak. Maybe they've done some internal testing and realized like if you start generating tons of this card, it's super frightening. And also probably super unfun to play against. Okay, we now get to a Murloc, and I don't feel like we've seen too many Murlocs recently. I feel like Murloc as a tribe, we've had a pretty bad time of it for the last year. This is a really good Murloc though. It's Brain Gale, 2 mana 2/1 Murloc. Battlecry, give all friendly Murlocs Death Rattle, draw a card. This is effectively composting on a minion. Composting used to be used in Druid, in the Treant Druid decks where you'd play a ton of tokens, you would compost them and it would give you another hand refill to fill your board with Treants again, and you would just try and like continuously play ginormous boards. In that deck you had to beat against it or win against it, you'd have to deal with like 3 boards roughly worth of minions. If you could deal with those 3 boards without dying, you normally won, because eventually they would run out of cards in their deck or they would run out of compostings as well. Brain Gale and Murloc packages are typically fairly tokeny in their own right. They're fairly tempo orientated, so there's not a big jump between a Treant deck and a Murloc deck. The only problem is there's not a lot of good Murlocs right now, so maybe this is going to be a sign that they're going to print some more Murlocs in this expansion as well, because currently I just don't see the world where it's played. Like maybe, you put a Murloc Tidehunter in your deck, which generates you another Murloc. You play a Brain Gale as a package that becomes 4 mana 5/3, draw 3 cards when your minions die, which is like, it's fine. But I think there are better aggressive things you can do with the other classes, specifically pirates. So I just assume it's going to have to be, we'll see some more Murlocs and then Brain Gale will make more sense. As a concept though, the card is actually just really strong. It just doesn't have the support right now. Also worth noting on this card, one of the Murlocs that is seeing minor play, I suppose, is Carefree Cookie in the Shaman Demon Hunter decks. Not very good, though, the Shaman Murloc, because you don't want to evolve this card, because you will lose the... Or, I'd say this card. You don't want to evolve a card that's given the Death Rattle Draw a card effect, because it will lose the effect on it. So, just be careful of that type of thing. Now, I believe the trigger will work that the minion will die, give you the Death Rattle, and then evolve, so you're fine as long as you do it that way, but just, like, again, be careful with the, like, evolve packages with Shaman, because you don't want to evolve this effect. It's a pretty good effect on it. So, we'll see how it all works together. Another card which I think is pretty good but won't see any play is Escape Pod. 3 mana 2/1, Rush. Death Rattle, give adjacent minions +1/+1 and Rush. Very similar to Wriggling Horror. That was a card that saw some play. Oh god, what was this in? This was in Madness of the Dark Moon Fair, right? Was it around there? In some very aggressive zoo-like decks, if you could put 2 minions on the board before turn 2, and Demon Hunter could do this, and you play a Wriggling Horror, it's effectively like a 2 mana 4/3 in stat line, and 2/2 of that was going to be fast, since the minions wouldn't have Summoning Sickness on the board, assuming, you know, they'd come from turn 1. That was really frightening. This Wriggling Horror deck was pretty frightening in Zoo. Escape Pod costs 1 more mana, but the minions get Rush on top of it, and also the minion itself has Rush. So, I've said in the past that you want the fast effects like with Battlecry versus getting a Death Rattle. If you're going to have a Death Rattle effect though, if you have Death Rattle plus Rush, it almost becomes Battlecry. And indeed, with 1 health, it is effectively like a Battlecry, because you are going to be able to kill a 1 health minion, for the most part. I know you could get a 0 attack minion, but for the most part, you're realistically going to kill the Escape Pod on the turn you play it. Unfortunately, though, I just don't see the world where this is played. There's actually a pretty big difference between it being 3 mana and 2 mana. At turn 3, your opponent is more likely to be able to deal with minions on your side of the board than later on into the game. Rather than early on into the game. So it's unlikely that you're going to get 2 minions living on the board, and it's a very conditional requirement for the Escape Pod to be good is that it hits 2 minions. If it doesn't hit 2 adjacent minions, the card is pretty garbage. Now, you can time this with the parachuting pirates, I suppose. For example, the aura that summons them on the next turn, so you're guaranteed to have those minions. And indeed, maybe that is the place where the Escape Pod is most likely to see play. But I just don't see a world where you fit this card, the Escape Pod, into that package. I think it's too tight a list right now. Also, to put like a bit of a nail into the coffin of this card, the effect of giving a minion +1/+1 and Rush is somewhat valued at 0 mana right now because of Through Felon Flames. Now, Through Felon Flames has been seeing play, and it does require you to finale to get the +1/+1, but normally in these tempo-orientated decks, it's fairly easy to finale this card. It's fairly easy to spend 1, 2, 3 mana on curve, especially in the case of Demon Hunter when your button is it's 1 mana. So, I don't know exactly what to value this adjacent minions +1/+1 and Rush. I kind of see it as like, maybe it's a half mana type effect, in which case you're getting like a full mana effect of the Death Rattle, and then you're getting it on a 2/1, which kind of evaluates the 2/1 Rush as a 2 mana card. And I just think, as much as like you can say you bundle the package together, it improves it, I just think it's slightly understated for modern Hearthstone to see any play. So it's a nice card, it's fun, it rewards having minion-based combat, but there's cheatier things you can do. Lightfuse Mana Saber, a new beast, has arrived. 6 mana, 6/6, Rush, Spellburst, gain Divine Shield. When I saw this card, I immediately thought of Goody 2 Shields. This was like one of the classic Spellburst cards back from Scholarmance. Now this card started with Divine Shield, which is like one of the nice things about it, versus Mana Saber, which doesn't start with the Divine Shield. And the big thing about Goody 2 Shields was you would play it, your opponent would break the Divine Shield. They'd probably struggle to then deal with the 4/2 afterwards. It'd come back to your turn, you'd play a spell, and it would get Divine Shield again. And effectively, you'd have to do like 3 sources of damage to kill this card, which was really expensive in the early game. Like, it was just really hard to deal with. Now, Lightfuse Mana Saber has the advantage that it has Rush on it. However, it doesn't start with the Divine Shield at first. So, I think all in all, it ends up working as a little bit worse than Goody 2 Shields. Also, at turn 6, you're more likely to have ways to deal with the minion with Divine Shield than at turn 3. So, it's just a bit unfortunate it comes in a little bit later into the game. Kind of the big nail in the coffin of this card, and why I just don't think it'll see any play, is Siamat is a 7 mana 7/7, which could give you Rush and Divine Shield if you chose those 2 options. And Siamat sees 0 play, and this is not Not an inconceivable option for CMAT to pick the Rush Divine Shield option. So, since CMAT with a more flexible outcome doesn't see any play, I just don't see a world where Light Fuse Mana Saber sees any play either, so I just think this is going to be a pack filler card. We've also got a new pirate. We have Space Pirate, 1 mana 2/1 pirate, Death Rattle. Your next weapon costs 1 less. Okay, we've seen a lot of these cards throughout the history of Hearthstone where it's, you know, an effect that discounts the next X by 1 less, or by X less, I suppose. Frequency Oscillator sees little bits of plays in some decks to discount a mech by 1, for example. Busy Peon, though, on the other hand, doesn't see any play. It was in the recent mini set. That discounts a location by 2 less. So what gives? Like, what was the difference between, like, Peon versus Oscillator? Well, there are a few differences between these cards. A card that discounts a type of card is considerably better when that type of card is more broad. Like, if it was to, like, discount a minion by 1, that is fantastic, because you're likely to play a minion during the course of the game, and you're also likely to have a minion in your hand. When you get to tribes, you narrow the pool slightly, but you're probably going to put a bunch of those tribes in your deck. So you're probably going to get the effect, and this is kind of where Frequency Oscillator comes in. It allows you to play Ziliax earlier, is effectively the deal for this, so... also, you can put some other mechs into your deck and get that 1 mana discount, which kind of treats the Frequency Oscillator as like a 0 mana 2/1. Another big thing is timing. So one of the nice things about the Frequency Oscillator is it improves the timing of some of the other mechs that you might play down the road. Let's say you play the Frequency Oscillator on turn 1. It might allow you to play Ziliax 1 turn sooner than you otherwise would have been able to play it. The problem with, like, Busy Peon is there's actually no locations that cost 5 right now. And Peon might be nice if you could Death Rattle it to discount a 5 cost location down to 3 and then you curve it on 3. Currently the best thing you can do is take a 4 down to 2, and then you're playing a 2 mana location on 3, and it means that you have to spend that 1 extra mana, which is a little bit awkward. There's also other benefits, like, for example, Battle Cries are typically better than Death Rattle's fast acting effects. So where do I think Space Pirate fits into all of this? I think it's not terrible. It is unfortunate it's a Death Rattle and not a Battle Cry. It's also unfortunate weapon, whilst it's not a particularly fine group of cards, you normally don't run more than 4 weapons in a deck. That's probably like the peak of weapons you'd put in your deck. And it's normally about 2 weapons, so you might not see this discount during the course of a game if you're really unlucky and you just don't find your weapon. Now, one of the things going for it is there are pirate decks right now that are running weapons. There is a pirate Demon Hunter deck that's doing the rounds, and they run Quick Pick in their deck. You could potentially play Space Pirate in that deck. The Space Pirate is probably going to die on turn 1. 2/1 stat line is reasonable on 1, and it's started aggressively, which is what I think you want for this, like some sort of tempo aggressive deck. Space Pirate dies. It means on turn 2 you could play your Quick Pick, and for Demon Hunter you could push the button as well and turn it into a 2/2 for that turn. Not unreasonable on the timings, right, for that card. Maybe also this helps something like Water Cannon, for example. You can play it 1 turn earlier. Water Cannon, I think, is a bit overpriced at 4. At 3, though, would this card with the Pirate Rogue package see some play? Maybe, but I'm not entirely convinced by it. One of the cards that it would improve the timing on, and was a pretty strong weapon, though, is going back to Demon Hunter land, Umpire's Grasp. Now, I know what you're saying, and I don't know, Umpire's Grasp is 4 mana. It is 4 mana right now in the game. If you could discount this to 3, you'd get it back to what Umpire's Grasp used to be for Window Shopper Demon Hunter, a deck that was nerfed because it was so strong. Kind of implies that Umpire's Grasp is really good at 3, which it is. It helps the timing of not only the Umpire's Grasp, but also the demon that you summon from the Umpire's Grasp. It comes up a turn early. It's actually crucially important how quickly you can get your Umpire's Grasp up. Now, if you go onto the card library right now, Umpire's Grasp is actually showing on the card library as 3 mana. In the game, it's a 4 mana card. I don't know if this means that the card is going to be unnerfed, because normally when you see stuff like this in the card library, it is Hearthstone team doing an oopsie and accidentally releasing the cards into the library in a patch state. So I don't know if this is a planned patch for the future. They're going to take Umpire's Grasp back down by 1. It might make some sense because they're trying to push this idea of Demon versus Draenei together. And Umpire's Grasp would be a really good card in a Demon package. And I assume Demon Hunter is going to be a Demon package. So watch this space. This might be an unintended leak. But either way, if you can get Umpire's Grasp reduced to 2 mana, then that is insane with the Space Pirate. You do your Umpire's Grasp deal, you discount a demon by 2, and maybe you even play that on 3. Crazy, right? Also, obviously, if you want to make the bread, if you want to get the bread, Rye Cleaver coming up a turn earlier improves the Rye Cleaver. Every turn earlier you can play the Rye Cleaver, the better it gets. Do I think you're going to put your Space Pirate in your Rye Cleaver deck? I mean, maybe, but do I think you're going to win with that deck? No, so I probably wouldn't recommend you doing that. Anyway, that's it for this bundle of neutrals. I think we are going to be seeing some more neutrals over the course of the next few days. In fact, maybe even today we'll see some more neutrals. And then we'll start getting into the meat and potato of the class cards as the weeks go on. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, why not leave a like and subscribe? Everyone helps me out, and I'll see you next time. Bye!